In this video, I want to explain some writing exercises in relation to the IELTS exam. So I'm going to show you a text that somebody has written as an example for writing in the IELTS exam. And I want to show you the corrections for the writing and maybe to show you how the examiner checks the writing part, just to show you some advice and some tips, the best way to try to prepare a writing part, in my opinion. So I'm going to show you the screen and you can see in the IELTS exam, basically the criteria for the assessment, there are 4 parts of the criteria. So when you write in the IELTS exam, there are 4 parts that the examiner looks for. The first part is the task achievement. The second part is the coherence and cohesion. The third possibility is lexical resource. And the fourth criteria is grammatical range and accuracy. So let me explain a little in relation to this criteria. So the task achievement is related to the question. So when you have a question in the IELTS writing or the Cambridge writing or the Escuela Oficial de Idiomas, every writing exam in English, you have a question and you have a lot of detail in the question. So it's so important in your answer that you address, that you mention, that you describe every part of the question in the answer. That's the first thing. So for example, here you can see the question for today's video. And the question is here. So basically you live in a room in a college you share with another person. However, there are many problems with this arrangement and you find very difficult to work. So that's the introduction. Your job, you need to write a letter to the accommodation officer at the college. In the letter, you need to describe the situation. You also need to explain your problems and why it is difficult to work. And also you need to say what kind of accommodation you would prefer. So in this question, you have 3 very, very clear jobs to do. That's the significance of the task achievement. So basically, in your answer, it's necessary that you speak, that you write about the 3 parts sufficiently. That's the first part. And obviously, in the IELTS, the band is maximum 9 and the minimum is 0. So you want the score or the mark close to 9. That's the best score that you want, is level 9. So if you answer every part of the question, this gives you a better opportunity to have a very, very high score. I know it sounds simple, but it's very important to remember in these exams that you really need to answer every part of the question. So again, if you focus on the question, you need to really understand the question perfectly. You need to read in detail the question and you need to answer specifically every part of the question with sufficient content. That's the first part, okay? The second part of the criteria is coherence and cohesion. So basically this is related to linkers, maybe. So how you connect 2 sentences, how you connect 2 paragraphs. For example, linkers are probably very important in this area. However, first of all, secondly, on the other hand, furthermore, so the linkers are necessary and it's important they are appropriate depending on if the letter is formal or if it is informal. And I think this situation is very formal letter because it's a work-related letter. So you need to keep in mind the important linkers and the appropriate linkers for formal situations. So that's a big part of the coherence and cohesion. Obviously, the organization is important. So there needs to be a very good order to your letter. There needs to be very clear. It needs to be logical. It needs to be connected. And that's really important in that category of coherence and cohesion. The third criteria is lexical resource. So this is basically related to vocabulary. So obviously the topic is related to accommodation. The topic is related to university. So you need to try and use vocabulary that is specific to this topic, okay? And you need to be careful because there's basic vocabulary, there's more advanced vocabulary, and then there's really advanced or proficient vocabulary. And for the better score, if you want closer to 9, the best idea is to use vocabulary that's less typical. Okay, so more advanced, more difficult vocabulary is better for you if it's appropriate to get the level 9 for your mark. So the vocabulary is a big part of the exam. So as you can see, the question is related to university, to college. So maybe my housemate, my flatmate, lots of adjectives to describe the uncomfortable situation. It's very uncomfortable, very noisy. I cannot concentrate. So maybe that vocabulary is very basic. So definitely you need time to think about the more advanced vocabulary and you need time to consider all the options. But basically your vocabulary is a big part of the test. And if you can show very, very good range and a good variety and less common vocabulary, this is better for you to have a higher score in every English exam and the IELTS also. The fourth criteria is related to grammar and the range of the grammar and the accuracy. So again, it's necessary that you take time and that you try intentionally to use more complicated structures. For example, the conditional, the perfect, the passive. These are very good structures you should use to have a higher mark, because most people might use the basic structures, the simple, the past simple, future simple, present simple, but it's a better idea if you can to use more complicated structures. For example, the present perfect, past perfect, present continuous, conditionals, modals. So passive and active, these type of tenses are very, very impressive and very good if you can use them correctly. And if you do, you are more probable, more likely to have a higher score. So that's the criteria in every writing in English. So in the IELTS exam, you have two tasks, task 1 and task 2. So it's necessary you remember this criteria first. In the Cambridge exams, it's very, very similar. The criteria is practically the same. And for this reason, it's necessary to remember in detail the criteria. Okay, so remember the question also. You need to remember the detail of the question, and then you need to try and write your question. So that's the specific question here, and you need to write at least 150 words. You do not need to write an address at the top, so it's not necessary to write an address for the letter, and you should begin your letter with dear sir or madam. So that's the first details that you need to remember to start your letter. And here on this page, they show you an example. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next page and you can see a sample of somebody's writing. And now I want to read, I want to give you my opinion about the corrections or the possible changes to make to this letter. Okay, so let's see. It says, dear sir or madam, and you have the date on the right. So I think that's maybe optional. I don't think it's too important to have the date, but we begin. I am writing to express my dissatisfaction with my roommate. As you know, we share one room. I cannot study in the room at all if I still stay there. Okay. She always has friend visiting and has parties in the room. They make lots of noise and switch on the radio very loudly. For me, this environment is very difficult to study and I need a quiet room. Even borrows my things without asking. It is very impolite. So just to begin, we will analyze the first paragraph in relation to corrections, in relation to the criteria, the 4 criteria, and I can give you my opinion and give you my advice in relation to this letter. So obviously, sir or madam, I think is the good introduction. Probably I would change a little because the advice, the real recommendation they give you is dear sir or madam. And in this letter, the person just had the slash. So that's a probable error already. So I would say dear sir or madam, and the spelling is okay. I am writing to express my dissatisfaction. For me, that's good. No problem. Very good. With my roommate. And probably, I think roommate, you can maybe have one word. I think that would be an option. But here you can see it's one word. You can also say flatmate, because in the letter, in the question, they say, well, they don't mention your flatmate. They don't mention your roommate. So for me, it's flexible. You can say roommate. You can say flatmate. So that's flexible. There's no real problem there. And there's no real other possibility for more advanced vocabulary in that situation. I think it's your roommate or your flatmate. Okay. So I would probably eliminate the hyphen. That's a little error already. As you know, we share one room. No problem. Usually, after as you know, it's probably likely to have the comma. Okay, so normally after this expression, we have the comma, as you know, comma, but it's not really a big problem. We share one room. I cannot study in the room at all or anymore. So the student has selected 2 options, at all or anymore. And in the exam, you should choose one, obviously, because it's a formal letter and you need to be very precise. You need to be very confident and you need to be very sure with your letter. And this writing with 2 possibilities is a bit unprofessional and it's not really, really good. So grammatically, I think the 2 are good. But when you're presenting this letter, it should be clear, it should have no errors really. And in a formal situation, it's not appropriate to have two possibilities. You need to select the best option for yourself and just write the first option. So in the room at all, if I still stay here. So the second part of the sentence, if I still stay here, would probably make it more appropriate to any more. So I cannot study in the room anymore if she stays here or if I stay here. Okay, so probably any more is maybe more appropriate than at all. In relation to cannot, this is very interesting as well, because when you text with your friend, when you write with your friend, it's very typical to say can't. And in a formal situation, it's more appropriate and more correct to write cannot. In the formal situation, it's better to write cannot. So for this reason, I think this is a small correction to make. I think it's necessary to write the word cannot together. Study in the room, if I still stay here, not too bad. Very simple, very clear. And you could consider extra or more advanced possibilities. And you need to take time to consider your best vocabulary and your more comfortable expressions. That's very individual for each person. So you need to take time to try to consider vocabulary. But here, I think it's very basic and very simple at the moment. Okay, she always has friend visiting and has parties in the room. Not bad, very clear, very simple. Again, it's the present simple. But there's a little error here or a little correction that we need to make. And has friend. So this is really the word that we need to change, because the two possibilities, she has a friend, okay, or the second possibility is the plural, she has friends. Okay, so really you need to select one of the two. She has a friend singular, or she has friends plural. And here there's no article, so this is the error. We need to say friends with the S, or a friend visiting, and has parties in the room. Again, very simple, present simple, not difficult. They make lots of noise and switch on the radio very loudly. Not bad as well. So the structure to make noise is a good structure. They create a lot of noise. And again, you can probably consider more advanced structures, and you need to take time to try to build your sentence and to build your vocabulary to make it more impressive. So here it's very, very simple and it's very clear. But to have a higher mark, it's definitely recommendable to try and introduce less common vocabulary and less common structures for your range of your grammar. Okay, and here it's a good example of just very, very simple text. They make lots of noise and switch on the radio very loudly. For me, that's okay as well. I just have a little doubt maybe with the verb to switch on and to turn up. Okay, because she or he selected the word loudly, that's the adverb, and it's a bit unusual to switch on loudly. We normally turn up the radio very loudly. Okay, so because you just switch on, that means to start the radio. It's a bit strange, in my opinion, to connect with loudly. So I would be more comfortable. They turn up the music very loud, or they increase the volume very loud. So here, that would be a little doubt that I have. So switch on is very good vocabulary, but I probably would not associate it frequently with loudly. Okay, so that's just my opinion. And I think that would be the same opinion of a lot of native speakers as well. For me, this environment, so maybe it's a full stop. The punctuation, possibly here we have a full stop and start a new sentence. I think it might be an option. For me, comma, this environment is very difficult to study. Okay, and maybe we would say this environment is very difficult to study with the preposition in. I think that might be a little bit better. So this environment is very difficult to study in. For me, I would definitely include the preposition here. And I think that's just a little bit more appropriate as well. But only a small detail really. So again, just a little small correction. This environment is very difficult to study in, and I need a quiet room. Again, no problem. But again, the vocabulary is very simple. The structures are very, very basic and very simple. So if you want to have a very impressive score, you need to try and reconstruct your sentences to make them a little bit more advanced and a bit more range and a bit more fluent. And I think that's very obvious already from this first paragraph. Okay. Even borrows my things without asking. It is very impolite. So vocabulary impolite is fine. Again, quite general, not really more advanced. And this structure without, it's typical with the ing, with the gerundio, without knowing, without going, without asking. So that's a good structure. And the verb to borrow is a very important structure as well. And most people need to be very clear with the difference between to borrow and to lend. So I borrow your telephone, but you lend me your telephone. So to repeat the sentence, I borrow your telephone, but you lend me your telephone. So the verb to borrow and to lend is very important, and it's necessary. You're very precise and you're very accurate with the two, because it's really, really important in English to know the difference between to borrow and to lend. Okay, so here it's good and it's correct, but because it's a verb, we need the subject. So it's very important to include the subject in this sentence. So she or he even borrows my things without asking. It is very impolite. So not bad, a very basic sentence, but probably I would include a linker here. So until now, the student has not really included a lot of linkers to make it more cohesive. And I think that's very important in these exams. So to improve that sentence, we could say, she even borrows my things without asking, which I think is very impolite. Something like this structure will make it link a little bit better. So again, it's a very individual job, and you need time to consider your own vocabulary to try to construct your own sentence comfortably for you. But for me, we need a little improvement for that paragraph. So you can see, not bad. It's very understandable. It's very clear, but there's definitely more improvements this student can make to make this paragraph a little bit better, and to make the letter more coherent, and to make it more advanced. So this is the reason maybe practice is very important. Students should try to practice writing regularly, and should get the opinion of maybe a fluent native speaker or a teacher to try to help and give some little detail and little advice, because in the exams, the examiners really look for the detail and they look for the criteria, as I said, in relation to the 4 criteria. Okay, so that's the first paragraph. We can continue with the second paragraph. I request you can give me a new room next term, because I have been asked her has parties in other place many times. They still have parties in the room. I really cannot stay in the same room with her. I would be grateful if you could change me a single room. Yours faithfully, Catherine. Okay, very interesting. Again, quite understandable. The communication is clear. I totally understand the message. Everybody understands the message. But in relation to grammar, in relation to punctuation, in relation to vocabulary, in relation to coherence, there's definitely improvements that this person can make. Also, in relation to the task achievement, does this student deal with every part of the question? I think more or less yes, but we will see at the end there's something important in relation to the task achievement, because there's 3 parts of the question that was needed to answer. And I think she addressed or dealt with 2 of them very well. But the third one, in relation to the room, to explain the room that she would like to move to, I don't think she really dealt with that very, very well, not sufficiently. Okay, so I request you can give me a new room. So probably with the verb to request, we need a little improvement here. So I request, and again, that is probably the most typical structure. I request that you give me a new room, because the modal verb here, she says can, and can is related to permission and it's related to ability. But if you request, it's more demanding. So you want, it's not really an option. So you request, you demand that they give you a room. Yes, they can because it's their ability, but you don't want to be maybe use the verb can in this situation. You want to be more direct. So I request that you give me a new room. Again, it's very simple. And again, you need time to maybe consider more advanced structures and more advanced vocabulary to improve that sentence. Always, you need to try and improve your sentence. And this is the reason probably practice is very important, to try to be comfortable, to be confident with making more advanced and more complicated structures. That's really why practice is important, okay? Next term, because now this sentence was the most confusing sentence in the text. So obviously there's a lot of errors in this sentence, because I have been asked her has parties in other room, other place many times. They still have parties in the room. So when I read 2 or 3 times, I can probably understand the significance. I think the person wants to say, I have been asking her to have parties in other places. So I'll just change my text in other places so you can see the correction is maybe more important. So I have been asking is the present perfect continuous, and this is a very, very good structure. It's very good for the range of the grammar, and this type of structure is very impressive when people write exams. So this is a good example of a very complex structure, well, a more complex structure, and this type of structure is recommended that you try to use them frequently to improve your score. But obviously in this text, it's not constructed very well. There is an error. So not bad, because it's good that you try, it's good that you attempt, but it's also necessary that you try to be very accurate and precise to have a high score. So the correct structure, I think, is I have been asking her to have. So again, she needs to conjugate the verb here better, to have parties in other place. And the key with other, when we use other, we need the plural, other people, other days, other weeks, other years. And here it's other. So she needs plural, other places, many times. And again, she moves to a new sentence or a new clause without any linkers. So probably you can consider a full stop. You can maybe end the sentence here and begin a new sentence, or you can use a word that connects the two phrases better, because I think here she definitely needs a word to link the sentences better. And for example, I have been asking her to have parties in other places many times. However, but they're two very simple linkers. It would improve the sentence. But again, if you want to have a higher level, you need time to consider and to choose a more appropriate linker for yourself, a more comfortable linker for you, or even stop the sentence and begin a new sentence again. So they still have parties in the room. I really cannot. And again, this suggestion previously, I would say cannot, because it's a formal letter. And definitely this is a little tip. In formal letters, we need to write cannot fully, which is more appropriate. I cannot stay in the same room with her. Again, understandable, clear, direct, but the vocabulary is very, very basic. And my recommendation probably for sure is to try and increase the vocabulary in relation to this text, because it's good, it's clear, but definitely you could improve the vocabulary and you could make it more fluent and make it more advanced. That's something to remember and to keep in mind. Okay, and then the final sentence, I would be grateful if you could change me a single room. Understandable, not 100% correct. I think here there's a little punctuation, there's a little apostrophe, but it's not appropriate because the apostrophe is normally with I'd, but the correct one is I would. So I don't know if this is a printing error or if it's just a mistake from the student. It's a very simple, a very clear mistake if it's the apostrophe. So obviously we need to say I would be grateful. Good vocabulary, grateful is good vocabulary. It's like I would appreciate if you could. So again, this is the modal verb. It's more polite. If you could, if you may, if you might. May is maybe more polite. Could is general. Change me the room. So this structure I would recommend to change a little, because we would say to change the room and not to change me. So we would say to change the room for me, I think is more appropriate, because we don't want to change me. We want to change the room for me. So just a little detail, but I think it's necessary to improve that sentence. And as I said, the correction would be to change the room for me. Or again, for sure, we can think of better vocabulary instead of change, because change is very simple. We could say swap, we could say exchange. So you need to think of more advanced vocabulary and better synonyms always in your exams to increase your mark. Okay, and then finally, the salutation or the salute or to say goodbye is close, but the typical structure is yours with the S. So this student has forgotten or made the error in relation to the S. So it's necessary to include the S. Okay, so an interesting letter, just to check the question again. So here's the full question. Describe the situation. I think more or less this student, yes, describe the situation. Explain your problems and why it is difficult to work. Probably yes, I think the student did explain her problem and why it is difficult to work. say what kind of accommodation you would prefer. I think probably not. So if you look at the end, I would be grateful if you could change me a single room, but she didn't really say, or she didn't describe what kind of accommodation. Yes, it's a single room, but she would probably need, and in the exam, the examiner will require more content and more explanation in relation to the final part to say what kind of accommodation. Okay, so just remember that the criteria at the top here, just to remind you, there are 4 criteria. And the first one is the task achievement. So did the student deal with every part of the question? I think the first part, yes. I think the second part, yes. I think the third part, in relation to say what kind of accommodation she would like, I think probably not. I don't think there's sufficient content for the third part of the question. For this reason, I think the score for the task achievement is maybe so-so. It's not really advanced because the student forgot really to deal with a big part of the question. So that's a very, very big error, in my opinion. And I think the mark will be a little bit lower because of this. The coherence and the cohesion, the organization of the text is not bad. It's so-so again. It's not really logical or clear, perhaps, but specifically in relation to the coherence and the linkers, I don't think there's sufficient linkers in that letter to make it very fluent and to make it very cohesive. I think she is missing, or this student is missing, a lot of linkers to make the sentences more fluent, to make it more comfortable, to make it very easy to read. Because in the letter, it was very simple. It was understandable, no problem, but it was very simple and it wasn't very fluent. Okay, so this part, coherence and cohesion, is something everybody needs to practice and try to be better. But in this example, I think it was lacking, or it was missing a lot of cohesion and a lot of linkers. And for this reason, I think the score will be probably low and maybe middle for this category of the criteria. Remember, 0 to 9 is the score and 9 is the best. In relation to lexical resources, again, the vocabulary is clear. It's very simple. It's very, very basic. So all of the letter, the vocabulary was really basic, nothing really dramatic, nothing really less common. And for this reason, again, I think the score will be so maybe low or maybe middle. And you can see the secret to try and increase your score is really to use appropriate vocabulary and less common vocabulary related to the topic. So it's necessary the vocabulary is appropriate, and it's also necessary it's less common and more advanced. That's the secret to have a higher score in that category of lexical resource. And the final category of grammatical range and accuracy, there was definitely a lot of errors in the accuracy, little errors, but very obvious errors for the grammar. And also the range, I really don't think there was enough range for the grammar. As I said, no passive, no conditional, no perfect. There was one very, very good attempt and one very good try. I have been asking her, but the accuracy was not good. So for this reason, the score, again, I think will be middle to low as well. So in general, there are 4 areas, and the examiner needs to assess each writing in relation to the 4 areas. And again, just to give you my opinion, I think that this letter, as I've said already, it's very clear, it's very understandable, but there's definitely a lot of improvement to make in the 4 areas: the task achievement, the coherence and cohesion, the lexical resources, and the grammar range and accuracy. They're the 4 things you need to remember in every writing exam. This is task 1, and in the IELTS you have 2 tasks. So for task 2, it's the same criteria. So you need to understand the question in detail, and you also need to produce a very good piece of writing in relation to the 4 criteria. In the Cambridge exams, it's basically the same. The 4 criteria is basically the same in the Cambridge exams, and probably Escuela Oficial de Idiomas, it's more or less the same. So for this reason, it's very, very valuable, and it's a very good idea to focus on the criteria and to know and to understand the criteria very well before you do the exam and before you actually practice regularly with the writing. So it's really, really important that you know exactly what you are doing. But for me, it's very, very good practice to analyze a text, and I'm very happy to analyze a text. And I encourage you, if you're watching this video and you want me to correct some of your writing, you can send me your writing and I can try to analyze and give you my opinion about your writing, because I think it's very good for me. It's very good for everybody to show online and to show a video to explain the corrections. And you can see here, this was the examiner comment of this particular letter. Okay, so here's the official examiner comment. Again, it's just a general idea because maybe sometimes examiners have little different opinions, but specifically here, you can see the comments in relation to the writing. And the level was 5. So remember, 9 is the maximum, and the examiner gave this letter a 5. So as I said, probably middle and a lot of room to improve. So the comment is there is some repetition of the task rubric. So that's a very strange word. And basically the rubric is like the detail of the question. So I think the comment is that the student wrote in the answer a lot of the vocabulary from the question. And this is probably a classic error. You should mention the question, but you should select synonyms and you should choose other vocabulary that is different from the vocabulary specifically in the question. So that's a very, very important part. And this is the comment from the examiner. And the content of the letter is rather thin. So thin is typical for a person, delgado in Espanol, but it is possible as well in relation to content of the answer. So another possibility would be light. So the content is very, very light, and maybe the limit of the words is 150, and maybe in this answer the letters or the numbers were less than 150, maybe significantly less possibly. But also in relation to the 3 parts of the question, it's probably rather thin, specifically the last part about recommending or suggesting the type of accommodation she would prefer. She did not really specify. She did not have a lot of content to say what type of accommodation she would like to move to. And for this reason, they said it's very light or very thin. In terms of its coverage of the 3rd bullet point, especially. So this is exactly what we said, the 3rd point to describe the accommodation. It's very, very light and very thin. The organization of ideas is not really logical. So the organization of the ideas is very important. You need to have a clear argument. You need to connect your arguments, and it's not really logical in this particular answer. That's the opinion of the examiner, and it's more or less the same what we have said. So the organization, like introduction, more or less, connect your introduction to the problem, connect the problem to the suggestion that you want to change, and maybe finish the letter very appropriately. So there should be a connection to all your writings, and that's important as well. So despite these problems, the introduction to the letter is appropriate and the purpose of the writer is clear. So this is again, more or less what I have said, that it's understandable, it's very clear, it's very direct, but it's missing a lot of detail for the higher mark, okay? And the points are not always linked together well. So that's the cohesion. There's no real linkers. There's no real cohesion. There are not appropriate linkers. And this is very important always in writing, and specifically in this example as well. So that's really important to try and to practice your linkers. But we have a lot of linkers, and it's appropriate, it's necessary that you try to remember the appropriate linker. And that's a big part of improving your writing. And punctuation sometimes is faulty. So we have identified some of the errors specifically in relation to apostrophe, in relation to full stop, and the punctuation is important for the cohesion of a letter and for writing in general. And then the sentences are kept quite simple. So again, it's quite basic for the grammar range. It's not really advanced for the grammar, and that's the comment of the examiner. Mistakes occur as soon as more complex are attempted. So to attempt is like to try, and there was a lot of mistakes, especially when the more complicated structure was tried, as we have seen here. But it is a good idea to try the complicated structures, but at the same time, it's necessary that you are accurate and that you are precise. Okay, so for me, that's really good practice. This is just from the IELTS website. It's the official IELTS website, and there's a lot of material on the IELTS website. And I recommend that you try to revise and research all the material on the website. This is just a video from me to give you advice and to give you my opinion. I have been a teacher for maybe 10, 11 years. And also on Wednesday, I have a specific webinar dedicated to preparation for the IELTS exam. And it's at 4 o'clock every Wednesday. And this is the type of material we do in the webinar with lots of different people. So that's Wednesday at 4 o'clock. We have a specific webinar dedicated to the IELTS, and it's open for everybody. You're welcome. There's a small fee of €2.90, which is very cheap. And this is the type of content we do in the webinar. But obviously you have to remember the different parts of the exam, the listening, the reading, the writing, and the speaking. And this is just a little sample of the writing part of the exam. So good luck with your study. Good luck with your preparation. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you have a comment and you want to leave a comment, please leave a comment at the bottom. And if you want to get in touch, you're very welcome as well. And of course, we have other classes available at 9 o'clock. We have a speaking class and we have webinars every day at 4 o'clock. So I hope you enjoy the Facebook page, the YouTube channel, and all the social media. And thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.